Hey there, ho there, church family. It's good to be with you again on a Wednesday afternoon. Going a little bit early today. I have an engagement later this evening, so I need to go get ready for that. Hope your week's gone well, and hope that you are healthy, and we look forward to seeing many of you again on Sunday as we continue worship. Also want to let you know that beginning July the 15th, we're anticipating coming back together on Wednesday night. We'll do some devotionals in the auditorium, have some time of singing and together, maybe learning some new songs and singing some of our old favorites. So just watch the blast for that. We'll keep you updated about details in the next week or so, but planning on July the 15th, being back together on Wednesday night. I'll keep doing these on Wednesday afternoon prior to that until we finish the book of Ruth, and then we'll decide where we're going to go from there. So last week we left the story of Ruth with Naomi and her daughter-in-law Ruth returning back to Bethlehem after a sojourn in Moab, where Ruth is from. And even though Naomi had insisted that Ruth turn back and go back to be with her own people, Ruth made a pledge commitment to her mother-in-law, who was going to have to take care of her and try to find out together, as all their spouses had died. And so they are two women who live in a patriarchal world with very little rights, very little opportunity for economic improvement and employment. Yet here is this Moabite woman, Ruth, who pledges this incredible vow to her mother-in-law through this message that we read in the middle part of Ruth chapter 1. Specifically in verses 15 through 18. And so as the story picks up, we'll pick up in chapter 1 and verse 19. Ruth and Naomi begin to enter into the city of Bethlehem, and we'll just start reading in verse 19. So the two of them went on until they came to Bethlehem. When they came to Bethlehem, the whole town was stirred because of them. And the women said, "Is this Naomi?" Remember that her name means pleasant. She said to them, "Call me no longer Naomi, but call me Mara," which means bitter. "For the Almighty has dealt bitterly with me. I went out full, but the Lord brought me back empty. Why call me Naomi, when the Lord has dealt harshly with me, and the Almighty has brought calamity upon me?" So Naomi returned together with Ruth the Moabite, her daughter-in-law, who came back with her from the country of Moab. They came to Bethlehem at the beginning of the barley harvest. It's really interesting in this section of Ruth chapter 1 and Naomi's complaint, as I like to call it. It's located between two really powerful passages of hope. The first is Ruth's commitment and pledge to her mother-in-law to stay with her till she dies, and then followed by the introduction of another one of the main characters in the book of Ruth, Boaz, who will figure greatly in this story as the story goes on, who was a kinsman of Naomi and Elimelech, who was a man of means, who had property, who had food, who had servants, who had wealth. And so he's introduced in chapter 2. But right in the middle of these two passages of hope and which seemingly from hard circumstances, this bright light that we see in these two passages, we get the complaint of Naomi. And so after the lifelong pledge that Ruth gives to her mother-in-law, they go back into the city of Bethlehem. People are excited to see them, the stir that's caused there. And then after the initial response of the crowd that sees Naomi and Ruth, and then we get Naomi's complaint. And so, I think we're reminded of God's providence and God's help and God's interest in what's going on, that they go back to Bethlehem again because there's food again. And so the house of bread, which is what Bethlehem means, becomes a place of sustenance and a place of nourishment once again, at least physically. It also means that because there's in the barley harvest, there's not only food available, there's hope that exists, new life and new futures and new opportunities. But Naomi doesn't see it that way. It's certainly apparent that from the time that she gets back into Bethlehem, that what once was this comfortable, pleasant life for her has now become really a struggle, or bitter, or the word Mara that we read. And she's really not expecting anything good to happen, even after that incredible vow of allegiance from her daughter-in-law. And so, as I mentioned, there's general excitement when they come to town. They're glad to see her, even though I'm sure they've heard now of the loss of Elimelech and Naomi's two sons. And so, but there is excitement, which says something about the character, I think, of Naomi, that in her community, she lived up to her name. She was pleasant, good to be around, brought energy and life into that community. And the people were certainly generally glad to see her, which is something that speaks to our communities, how important it is for us to have that and for us to interject life and vitality, and how we gain that from one another when we enter into a covenant community of God. So there are two key words, I think, in this passage that I want us to look at today about Naomi's complaint and how she saw life in her worldview. The first is the word Mara, or bitter. And then the second is the word empty, which is how she felt. And so as she begins her complaint or her lament, it's interesting, she doesn't blame her husband, Elimelech, for going to Moab and leaving Bethlehem in the famine. She seems to lay this at the feet of God, that what happened was that she went out pleasant because of what happened, the death of her husband, the death of her sons, now the increased responsibility of her daughter-in-law. She now sees herself as being bitter. She went out full, that is, family. She had inheritance. She had land. She had security from her husband and his family. And now that she's come back as this woman in this patriarchal age, she's got not much. Comes back empty-handed. And it's almost as if she looks at Ruth as a liability rather than a blessing. And I think we can also read from her words that she really doesn't expect anything good to happen going forward. And I know sometimes we get that way, and we may feel that way, that life just beats us up and beats us up and beats us up. Things happen that are beyond our control. Life was normal, and now it's not. Life was secure, and now it's uncertain. And I think it's a natural outflow sometime to lament. I will say this about lamenting. We live in a world that really cherishes and exalts comfort. We live in a therapeutic world. We want to feel good all the time. There is power in lament. There's power in struggle, and there's power in pain. There's power in suffering that we really go to great lengths to avoid, and sometimes it's really through that trial period and the period of times when we want to lament and that we cry out to God, that we really find a connection with God that's profound and deep. We get to look at within ourselves. We get to do some introspective about who we are and what our relationship is and how we feel. The beauty about lamenting, and the Psalms are full of laments, Jeremiah is full of laments, and this lament is God listens. And God hears, and God recognizes what we're going through. And I do believe this, for those in a covenant relationship with God, we have to believe that God will intervene, and that God's intervention will be powerful and will be for our good and be for the good of our community and the good of our context. And Paul mentions that in Romans chapter 8. So those two key words, how Naomi sees herself, bitter and empty, as opposed to how she should have been or was at one time, how she saw herself, is pleasant and full. And I wonder how often we rename ourselves just by the way we act and interact with others. And so as she renounces her pleasantness and she announces her emptiness, and she really does do this, she lays it at the feet of God. You can say she blames God. You can say that God had a hand in this, perhaps so, but she does lay this at the feet, which does speak, I believe, to her relationship with God. In all this trouble and all the pain that she has, is God still there? And she knows that. And I think there is some comfort for us in those moments of life when life is tough and we want to complain to God, knowing that God's there and God's listening. And so her bitterness, Mara, is really found about her emptiness. They coexist. She's lost security. She's lost relationships that were dear to her. She's lost all the stability and the hope for her future in a lot of ways, especially financially. What she's lost is a place that was home, because even though the property's still there, and the house is still there, and the furniture's probably still there, without her husband and her sons there, it's just different and it's not the same. Home has changed for her, which is a great, great concern for Naomi. And so there's this understanding that she has about herself and her life and her experience. She is bitter and she is empty. And so the story leaves us kind of with this, what's next? What's next for these two? We know the end of it because it's a short book. We can read it. But I think a lot of times that we are exactly like Naomi, that things happen to us and things happen in our life, and difficulties come and uncertainty comes and trials come, and we lament and we do wonder, what's next? Is God really in control? Does God really care about me? What am I in the big scheme of things in God's world? Little does Naomi know how valuable and how important she is to God's plan of redemption, and to God's redemption of the world and the salvation of the world through Jesus, because she is an integral part of that. And so, church, I think we've been there. What I would encourage us to do as we think about Naomi's situation and her plight, there's some really positive things that I think we can see even in this complaint and lament. Is one, there's a community around Naomi that truly does care about her. So those in Bethlehem that know her and know her family, you can see the genuine excitement and love they have for her when she comes back home. And I do believe this, we're not in this thing alone. We are truly in a covenant community that we are here for each other. So there's a positive just in the very onset when she comes into town. I think also we can take a positive, as I've mentioned before. Naomi never doubts that God's involved. There's no God's forsaken me, God's not here. There's no form of deism, that is, God just put it in motion and left us to our own devices. There's an acknowledgement that God's been integrally involved and intimately involved in her life. And so that's a positive. I think something else that's underneath all this is because of the devotion that Ruth has for her. There is a genuine care that this woman who feels bitter and empty, there's a genuine care that she has for her daughter-in-law, and a genuine acknowledgement of her daughter-in-law's commitment to her. And so, and even though at the moment, because pain is so pervasive and all the things that have happened to her are just pressing in on her, even for the moment that she can't see the goodness of God through Ruth, Ruth is going to be there too. And Ruth is going to be a constant reminder as the story goes on that God is present and that God is around and that God uses the most unlikely people and circumstances to remind us of the mercy, the faithfulness, the loving kindness, and the goodness of God. So we'll leave it on a kind of a down note right now. We had a great moment of hope last week. We're going to look at hope again next week. But I think in the meantime, it's good for us sometime to just sit back and to reflect upon the hardships of life, and where does God fit into that, and how does the community of faith fit into that? And can we really move ourselves then from bitter and empty to recognize that really with God that we are pleasant and full? God bless. Have a great evening. Lord willing, I will see many of you on Sunday. For those who it's still not time to come back and you're compromised and you want to join us, we'll stream live again at 9:30 on Sunday morning. May the Lord bless you and keep you. Have a good evening.